Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our virtual presentation of Oh Beautiful with author Jung Yun and our moderator for tonight, Elizabeth McKenzie. We will be taking audience questions towards the end of the event, so if you would like to submit a question, please use the Ask a Question button at the very bottom of the screen. You can also vote for any questions you'd like, and they'll make their way to the very top of the list. Also, please consider supporting Vroman's Bookstore by purchasing a copy of Oh Beautiful tonight. You can click on the green purchase button directly below the viewer screen, and it'll take you to our website where you can complete your purchase. Okay, so with that out of the way, let me introduce our guests, and then we can get started. So Jung Yun's debut novel, Shelter, was longlisted for the Center for Fiction's First Novel Prize and was a finalist for the Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers Award and was a semi-finalist for Goodreads Best Fiction Book of 2016. She was a MacDowell Fellow, and her work has appeared in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and Tin House, among many others. She is an assistant professor of English at the George Washington University and serves on the boards of directors of the Penn Faulkner Foundation. And joining her tonight is Elizabeth McKenzie. Her novel, The Portable Veblen, that is a tongue twister, was longlisted for the 2016 National Book Award for Fiction and was named a Best Book of the Year by NPR, the San Francisco Chronicle, Kirkus, and many more. She is also the author of McGregor Tells the World, Stop That Girl, and editor of My Post-War Life. So with that said, I'm going to hand things over to our lovely speakers. Enjoy the talk, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rira. Thank you to Vroman's for hosting us, and thanks so much to Lisa McKenzie. We were just saying earlier in the green room how Lisa and we met about 4 years ago. We did a festival in Cincinnati, and then we found out that we were also headed the same weekend to Pasadena for the Festival of Women's Authors. So we had a great weekend in Pasadena, and sorry we can't be with you in person, but it's so nice to be here during these times via Zoom. I'm going to read a really quick excerpt of Oh Beautiful just from the beginning, really short, just because I want to save as much time as possible to chat with Lisa and also take questions. But I thought I would begin just by telling you a little bit about the oil boom that serves as the backdrop for this novel. I grew up in Fargo, North Dakota, which is on the eastern side of the state. And the western side of the state, whenever we used to visit, I always thought it had more in common with Wyoming or Montana or Idaho. It's sort of more like the Rockies in the Midwestern part that I grew up in. The other thing about the western half is that it's built on a giant shale formation called the Bakken. And I think by conservative estimates, there are approximately 4 billion barrels of oil in the Bakken. And there are some estimates that go as high as 400 billion barrels of oil. So obviously that is a whole lot of oil and a whole lot of money. But for the longest time, there was no way of accessing that oil because it was trapped. It was fossilized in the shale. Until the advent of hydraulic fracking, and horizontal drilling. And suddenly, as these technologies developed, the housing market was crashing, the recession hit the United States, and there was an oil boom on in Western North Dakota. And tens of thousands of people from all over the country, some from all over the world, were descending upon this largely white, largely rural part of the state to try and make their fortunes in oil. And I always just thought that was really fascinating how many people came from all over to seek out their version of the American dream or American survival, if you will. So that's the backdrop of this particular book. And the novel is seen and narrated through the eyes of a woman named Eleanor Hansen, who is half Korean on her mom's side, half white on her father's side. She grew up on a military base not far from the Bakken. Her father was former Air Force. And she is a sort of a cub journalist, even though she's in her 40s. She's sort of starting a second career, and she is sent on assignment to a fictional town called Avery, North Dakota, to try to write an article about the oil boom. So The scene that I'm going to read is from early on in the book. Eleanor lives in New York, and this is her arrival in Avery. She is driving from the airport into the town that she hasn't seen in quite some time. So just to give you a sense of the narrative and what she sees. Over 20 years have passed since she last saw Avery, and she understands that things will look different now, but she's still not prepared for how different. A few miles after an exit for Teddy Roosevelt National Park, traffic begins to slow, and she finds herself in a caravan of dust-covered trucks and tankers and semis all crawling toward the town line. Then the fences appear on both sides of the road where old buildings are being torn down or renovated, and nearly every vacant lot is under construction. Signs announce the coming of an Outback Steakhouse, a Napa Auto Parts store, and a Home Depot. Billboards advertise newly built apartment complexes and housing developments with names that seem chosen at random without any connection to the landscape at all. The Monarch, the Lyric, the Eldorado. A new Ford dealership stands next to an even newer looking Walmart, both displaying patriotic grand opening bunting across their entrances. Even the bright gold streetlights look new, hanging at intersections that probably didn't exist before the boom. The lead of her article almost writes itself. In Avery, North Dakota, the epicenter of the North American oil boom, one might forget that the rest of the country is still struggling to recover from the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. The Thrifty Inn sits on the main road, sandwiched between a self-service car wash and the fire station. From a distance, it looks like every other budget hotel she's ever stayed at, except for the parking lot, which is completely full, littered with signs warning would-be trespassers to keep out. The vehicles in the lot are mostly trucks, passenger, cargo, semi, haphazardly parked in 1.5 spaces, sometimes more. Eleanor circles the lot twice before pulling onto a scrap of grass, following the lead of 2 other drivers who simply gave up and parked their huge SUVs on the yellowing lawn. The lobby has the feel of a train or bus station, with people coming and going in every direction. She squeezes through a crowded lounge area where guests, mostly men, are helping themselves to an anemic continental breakfast consisting of coffee, cereal, cups of yogurt, muffins wrapped in clear cellophane, and a basket of waxy-looking fruit. Eleanor joins the end of a line at the front desk, surveying her fellow guests, most of whom appear to be middle managers or consultants for oil companies, dressed in button-down shirts and khakis, but no ties. In her hungover state, she makes the mistake of looking at an older man for a few seconds too long. He responds by smiling lewdly at her, his capped teeth gleaming a glint of something silver. She lowers her head and stares at the dull brown carpet, trying not to roll her eyes at him, even though she wants to. The last time she did that to a stranger for telling her to smile, he followed her for 2 city blocks, shouting "cunt" at her back. And I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely.
I'd love to hear you read more. The prose is so flawless in this novel, so it's really nice to hear you read it. So the novel's been receiving fantastic reviews all over. I'm not surprised. You've partially summed up, the starting point of the novel, but there's so much else going on. I mean, Eleanor's Korean mother abandoned the family when Eleanor was 12, so she has that wound in her background. Meanwhile, she's recently ended a relationship with her mentor, who is a man named Richard, who she'll be finding out more about later in the novel. She arrives in Avery and starts encountering basically a whole constellation of people who make up, all the facets of this oil boom, from a salesman to a truck driver who brings sand for the fracking process, to a widow whose property has been basically destroyed by the lease of the mineral rights on the property, people living in cars because there's not enough housing to go around, the people who hang out in a rowdy club in town, and even the possibly corrupt chairman of the North Fork Reservation, and more. So every encounter, serves to illustrate another facet of what this oil boom has done to a place like North Dakota, but also peels back another layer of Eleanor herself. And she's constantly kind of, she's realizing things and discovering things all the time through the novel. And there's just an incredible sense of tension in the novel that you would think that this was like a thriller or something, but it's not. But it just, from the first chapter, I think the reader is really on edge. There's sort of a sense of menace all throughout. Then there's some more I want to mention. We meet her sister, who she has not seen in 9 years. They obviously have a very fraught and complicated relationship. And it seems like, we come to understand that booms like this really attract desperate people. And the novel shows that. And further, despite her glamorous veneer, Eleanor used to be a model. We start to understand that she shares some of that desperation, and that she's actually there for some of the same reasons that some of the more down and out people are there. So it's fascinating, and I would like to know how you wrote this book.
Oh boy. I should probably mention that when I first started, I knew that I wanted a really big cast of characters because that's who an oil boom draws. And I got it into my head, this sort of cockamamie structure of writing a novel in short stories. And that seems ridiculous to me now because I don't like writing short stories. I never have. But that was my way in initially. So I wrote 7 terrible short stories, mostly about men. Yeah, mostly about men. A couple of characters who actually show up in the book, but in shorter form. And Eleanor didn't appear as a character until the 8th short story. And suddenly, it opened so much up for me because previously I was writing these short stories about men who either grew up in North Dakota or men who had come to North Dakota. And then with Eleanor, I knew early on that I wanted her to be a writer, and having a writer going to this place created this all new lens where she has to seek strangers out. She has to talk to people who intimidate her. She has to go to a place that she has memories of and try to do her work, even though the memories keep sort of interrupting and interfering. So that was such a game change for me to have that discovery of a character who made the novel make sense in a way that it hadn't before. And, I still can't believe that I spent so much time writing it as I did as this novel in short stories. But I think that's kind of what you do. You just sit at your desk and you double down every day, and you get so far into it that you're afraid to give things up. But yeah, I gave up like 200 pages of a novel that structurally just wasn't working. And then I just sort of scrapped it and started again with her. And then it went from there.
Well, forgive this metaphor. So she's basically like the drill bit that found the oil. And
exactly. That's a good one. She helped me find the story. That's for sure. And helped me see what the story was.
Oh yeah. She's the perfect, lead, the guide into this story. And the whole structure of the novel, that she has to go talk to all these different people. It just works out perfectly, but it doesn't feel artificial. It's totally natural to the story. So
she's so bad at it though, especially in the beginning. She's so uncomfortable. She doesn't like talking to strangers. She knows she has to do it, but she always feels like she's inconveniencing people, which I think is, a part of her past. So she's a very sort of timid writer and journalist in the beginning.
Yeah, I like that she wasn't a pro, that she stumbled and made mistakes and stuff along the way. That was good. That was really
lots
good.
of mistakes. Definitely lots of mistakes.
Yeah. So you have 200 pages of material that you left out?
Yeah. I did. I remember when I did it, I was at the McDowell colony actually, and I went with the intention of finishing out probably like the last 150 pages of the book. But I don't know, something about being at a writer's colony and not having anything else to do, no other responsibilities for my time except to write. It kind of made me braver than I would be like during my day-to-day life when, you know, I'm juggling my teaching and my students and my home life with writing. So I just decided to kind of rip off this very big Band-Aid and start again. And I had I think 5-week residency there. And by the time I was done, I had kind of climbed back to about 180 pages of this new structure. So,
oh my God,
I know it was wild.
great.
I've never written that fast or that hard for such a short period of time.
Okay, yeah. I think, you know, the time frame in the novel serves you so well because basically the novel takes place in a few days. And I think that having every part of every day count creates a lot of tension, just, you know, and she's going always to the next thing, which is even more uncomfortable than the last. And it just, yeah, so I was in awe of the architecture of the book, the structure. I felt like it was like a Swiss watch that I wanted to, you know, like nothing was there by accident, that everything was contained in a, you know, a structure that nothing was wasted. And I wanted, you know, I just marveled at how smoothly it ran. And so that's not a question, but just an observation.
It was very unplanned, I have to say. I don't like outline, I don't structure my novels in that particular way. A lot of that, a lot of like knitting together different storylines and different characters intersecting and meeting up kind of comes through in the revision. But for drafting, it was just like a big mess of different people meeting each other and then slowly kind of carving out what mattered, which scenes needed to come to the surface and which needed to go by the wayside.
Did you start it, like, had you had the idea before Shelter or did it come after that?
It came well after that. And actually, I wrote it between the period of 2016 and 2020. So right after Shelter had come out, someone had given me the advice, like there's this sort of fallow period while you're waiting for your first book to come out where you might actually be able to start your next ones. And I was advised to do that. So I did. And it came out messy and rough, but I started.
That's when you started writing those stories?
Yeah, that's when I was writing those stories. Yeah. But I'd always wanted to write a novel that was set in my home state. I just couldn't figure out like how to approach the story until the oil boom happened. Like everything just felt like a kind of corny fish out of water story that I didn't want to spend 4 years or 5 years of my life writing. So yeah, the oil boom was kind of the moment where I realized like I had something that was worth chasing down for years and years. Yeah.
Do you, had you, like when you were growing up there, did you have any sense? I mean, I know that the fracking was what really started the boom, but they'd found oil earlier, right? But it just hadn't really.
They found it, but there was no way of really accessing it. So there were a couple of historic booms in North Dakota, and the thing is that Western North Dakota, lots of North Dakota actually is really agriculture based. So lots of farmland and people had mineral rights to sell. North Dakota is one of those states where you can separate the land rights and growing and using the land for whatever it's zoned for. You can separate those rights from the mineral rights. So you can sell off the ability to explore what is underneath the surface. A lot of families kept those mineral rights because nobody wanted them. They were cheap for the longest time. And then Some sold off in the 70s, and then a lot of people tried to sell off during this last boom, and some made money, and some, as you'll see in the book, sold them, but then got a lot more than what they bargained for.
Oh God, yeah. Yeah.
Poor Amy.
Exactly. There are a lot of threads that run through this book, such as the one about Leanne Lowell. Is that the right name? Yeah. That was a very menacing thread, but it turns out very differently than I expected. Many things turned out very differently than I expected, but very, very well. I was very impressed. Did you go to North Dakota while you were working on this and do some of this kind of research that Eleanor herself did?
Yeah, my parents lived in North Dakota until 2017. So I was always going back to the state at least once a year, sometimes twice a year. As I said, Fargo is on the eastern side, but I love road trips. And if I had time, I would always drive west to the Badlands of North Dakota, which is some of my favorite country to look at and to be in. It's a place that just means a lot to me and always has. So I would take these road trips out to Western North Dakota, and over the years of the boom, I got a chance to see how the boom was changing these very, very small, very isolated communities. But I was also sort of tracking like my own internal changes. When I was younger, I used to feel so conspicuous whenever we used to go visit out west because I wasn't white. And I just felt like we really stuck out as a family. But over the years of the boom, I started feeling more and more conspicuous because I was female and an Asian American female, and would encounter people who had all sorts of strange assumptions about what I was doing there. And I think I had like this sort of like resentful part of me because I'm in my 40s now. And even to this day, North Dakota is the place where I have lived the longest. It is my home state. And getting sort of, getting kind of the 21 question treatment from people who had literally been there for like a couple of weeks or a couple of months and wanting to know what I was doing. Right. And I'm like, what are you doing here? Yeah. So yeah, it was, I spent a lot of time going back and forth, and the novel itself is set in 2012, which is kind of the height of the boom. And yeah, I got a chance to watch communities just completely transformed over the course of a couple of years. It was wild.
Yeah. Wow. Well, did you plan Eleanor's character arc, or did that just kind of come as she experienced everything?
I knew that I wanted her to be a writer. The fact that she is an ex-model came in a little bit late, but I thought that was an interesting complication. And when I say she was an ex-model, I think I want to be really clear that she wasn't like a particularly famous or successful model. She was just attractive enough by conventional standards to be able to be in catalogs and model like kind of, unattractive clothes, and made a decent enough living, right? So yeah. She bought an apartment. She was able to save enough money to go back to college in her late 30s, which is how she ended up in this second career in her 40s as a writer. But I like the idea of her being someone who spent her late teens and 20s really courting the male gaze, because that was her profession. And also having this experience of feeling like she was dumb because people treated her like she wasn't a bright person, and then having to go back to school with a bunch of 18, 19, 20-year-olds and feeling like they were smarter than her. She enters into the story with not a lot of confidence, a pretty big chip on her shoulder, and just some bad memories of her family life growing up in North Dakota. She's biracial, so she always kind of had her foot in one community or another, but didn't really feel like she belonged anywhere, including home. So, the more I wrote her and the more I wrote into her, the clearer her arc became. But again, I don't plan anything. I sort of channel characters and just stick with them long enough to get a sense of what feels reasonable and right for them. But yeah, she ends the story, even though a lot of bad things happen. She ends the story, I think, on a hopeful note and a gesture that is one of faith.
Yes. Yeah.
And possibility. So that felt like the right arc to land on, but I can't say that I planned that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think all your instincts in the book just were right, and the book has turned out just beautifully. So there's a couple of like blurbs I saw you got that I just want to mention because I saw them after I'd read it, and this person, Wiley Cash, wrote, "No one laces a scene with menace or fits more emotional range onto the page than Jung Yun." And I was like, yeah, exactly. That was I think, very true. And then Anna North wrote, "Oh, Beautiful has all the propulsiveness of a mystery, but the stakes go beyond any single crime." I thought that was really true too.
Those were so kind. They were just like unbelievably kind blurbs.
Well, they're true. Yeah. So anyway, should we look at some questions from the audience?
Absolutely.
Okay. Vroman's asked, what was the most challenging part of writing your sophomore book?
Boy, I would love to hear your answer to this too, Lisa, but I think for me, it was like this false confidence. I thought that I had done the hard part, which was writing the first book and then, finishing it and publishing it, and then kind of walking away thinking like, I could do this. I could really do this. But boy, the second book was just a whole different set of problems because it's a whole different story. And I felt like I was starting all over again. And, thank goodness that I had finished my first book and published it, because if I hadn't had that experience, I don't know, like there were moments where I really thought like I should just put this away and start over and do something else. Yeah. I think like around short story number 4, I thought I don't want to do this. I don't want to live with this for as long as I'm going to have to make it work. So I guess like the most challenging part was learning that I have so much to learn, and every book is going to be different and have a completely different set of problems to solve. And it's never going to be easy. It might feel easier by small increments, but like writing a novel is just so damn hard. Right?
I totally agree with you. I feel like it is like starting from scratch with every new book. So, but you made it look easy.
Thank you.
I mean, it's complex, but it's very tight. Who are some of the men you wrote stories about? I'm just curious. Like,
the very first story in the collection, in the original collection, was Harry Burgram, who appears as one of the interviewees that Eleanor goes and meets. And Harry Burgram is a sort of old-timey character who is known as the mayor of Avery and the man who started the boom. And he was basically like a speculator of sorts. In the 70s, he went around buying up these mineral rights from different families for very little money. And then when the technology finally came and caught up, he made a boatload of money. And he was kind of known as the man who made the oil boom possible. And that's not a nickname that people often gave him with respect. There were a lot of people who blamed Harry Burgram for the problems that ensued afterwards because, these communities were completely unprepared to take in so many people from all over the country. It completely stretched infrastructure. It completely stretched resources. Roads got clogged up. There was traffic everywhere. There were people living in parking lots because there wasn't enough housing, and the housing that was available was so extraordinarily expensive. And then, of course, there were just huge spikes in crime. That the old narrative was that crime like that didn't happen in North Dakota before the boom, which some people believe. And for a period of time, Eleanor believes that too.
I like how you handled that.
Yeah. She learns and realizes that, crime has always been there. It's just that the crimes were happening to a lot of Native Americans who were living in the nearby reservation. So the crime was kind of turned invisible because of who the victims were.
Yeah, exactly. And then who else did you write about besides Harry?
So Harry and Randy Hudson, who is the chairman of the Mahua Nation, which they make their home on the North Fork Reservation. So he was a character who showed up in a story. And that one I just struggled with. I really did. But then his story opened up in the novel when I introduced a secondary character named Shauna Lee, who is his very beleaguered assistant who is sort of his right hand and does everything and keeps him on the straight and narrow, but is often frustrated with this man who has this like larger than life personality. It's important to him that his constituency loves him and cares about him, and he tries to put on a pretty good show for Eleanor while she's interviewing him because it makes for a good story. But she learns through other people who they interact with that maybe there's a bit more to Randy than meets the eye.
And it must be true. I mean, have there been a lot of bad accidents like the explosion that occurs in your novel? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. These oil fields were some of the most dangerous places to work in the country. And I mean, there were people who were doing the work who were either not trained very well or were trained far too quickly for the hazards that they were dealing with. So lots and lots of accidents, not at the extreme level that you see during the explosion, but lots and lots of people who, broke bones, had PTSD from various traumas on the job. It's really dangerous work. It's really dirty work. And I think one of the things that happens in the novel is that there's this current of shame that happens because a lot of these people who are doing the work, one, they have to because they're just trying to make a buck and they're trying to survive. But they're in a community that kind of wants their presence because of the money, the tax revenue, but also doesn't want them around. So, they're stressed, they're doing dirty work, they're doing dangerous work. And that's the backdrop for a lot of tension, I think.
Yeah, and then everybody lets it out, lets off the tension in the bar. And your bar scenes are very memorable. God.
Yeah. I sat in a couple of bars in the Bakken, and that was interesting.
Or did you? Oh my God. Yeah, those were really great scenes. So let's see, there's another question here. Your book explores tensions between newcomers versus old-timers, which are further complicated by race, class, and gender. Were these themes important for you to explore?
Those were the kinds of issues and topics that have populated my writing going back to some of the earliest things that I wrote, some of the short stories that I was writing in grad school. I've learned over time that the issues that I care about the issues that I want to explore in my writing, it's all about race and gender and class, particularly in the form of large-scale economic phenomenon. Like in Shelter, there was a recession and a housing market crash. And here in Oh Beautiful, there's a huge oil boom that changes the local economy. I think that there's so much interplay and intersections. There are so many intersections between these issues that really build on each other and complicate each other. You know, you have Eleanor, who is a middle class to upper middle class, college educated woman who is returning to a place where she never felt at home because of her mother's race, her mother's status as an immigrant, as a quote unquote foreigner. You know, everything kind of intersects and complicates and enriches each other in ways. And I realized, I was telling somebody this not that long ago, that for me, all of these issues were things that I was thinking about as a kid, as a teenager, growing up in North Dakota, because they were things that I was experiencing but didn't yet have the vocabulary to be able to express. So, I mean, North Dakota was really the making of me in terms of, you know, a writer who cares about these particular issues and wants to continue telling stories about these issues.
Let's see. Someone would like to know if you got to read your audiobook yourself.
No one would want to listen to that, Michael. Absolutely. Nobody would want to hear me do that. No, it was actually really great. I got a chance to listen to auditions of various narrators, voice actors, and I think they sent over 4 or 5 tapes. And the very last tape was a woman named Catherine Ho. And it was just instantaneous when she started reading that was the right voice. And that was the voice that I wanted to hear telling Eleanor's story. So Catherine was the person who was chosen for that job. And I think that she did such great work. And she's also a very popular voice actor and has done several books. And I like audiobooks. I really do. I walk a lot, so I'm always listening to them. And I think that a narrator can really make or break an audiobook selection. And I think she's just so talented and is one of these people who can really make a book that I'm not necessarily interested in, just feel really alive and real to me.
Yeah. I would never want to read my own book, that's for sure.
No. No, I would always be like flubbing it and then feel self-conscious that I'm like flubbing lines that I wrote. It would take forever. Definitely.
Yeah.
Thanks, Michael.
Here's a question from Vroman's. What was the most surprising or interesting fact you learned during your research?
There's a line in the book about how Eleanor, sort of on the surface, she knows that fracking and drilling, these are bad things, right?
I underlined that part. Yeah.
And
that
that
was
could
really good.
very well be me. It could very well be a lot of us who we know that there is a negative environmental impact from these types of technologies. But I think by virtue of doing so much research and learning what actually happens in the process of fracking and horizontal drilling, I mean, it's still sometimes kind of, it startles me awake every once in a while to think that there are companies that are just drilling miles deep into the Earth's surface. And then the thing that really freaks me out is how they turn the drill sideways. That's the horizontal part of horizontal drilling. And then they fill these gigantic holes with millions of gallons of water and chemicals and sand to make all that shale crack and release the oil. Like it was so surprising to me to learn just how devastating and how dangerous this work is. And I don't know, I feel like it's just messing with nature in ways that we were never meant to mess with it.
I mean, it's caused earthquakes and stuff, right?
Yeah. It just seems like something that we should not do. But, then again, there are 3 million 3 million miles of oil and gas pipeline in this country, and if oil companies had their way, there would be more. So I think that was one of the things that really startled me, which is that I found the evidence to inform myself about these notions about why these processes are so damaging to the environment. And it was really scary getting down into the details of them.
Yeah, you included that detail about how there's sort of an oily sheen to some water that comes out of a tap at somebody's house. And I mean, is that real? I mean,
yeah.
Did you see that happen?
I did not see it happen, but I've seen reports of that happen. You know, wells being infiltrated. It just fires sort of burning out in fields because of this sort of these oily substances that catch fire in the sunlight and the heat. So things like this definitely they do happen. It's research based and it's real. And what's shocking to me is that people lived with these things, right? They lived with all the dust and the dirt and the traffic and the smells. And, you know, there are many houses that I can remember and have taken photographs of where you could see the house, and then in the distance, like there's an oil well or two, like right in the back, just, you know, sort of chugging along. And I can't even tell you like how many houses I just wanted to go and knock on the door and say, can we talk about the situation here and how this all came to be? But didn't quite do that, but did meet a number of people who had chosen to go that route, not because they were greedy, not because they wanted to buy bigger houses or better cars or take nicer vacations, but that was one other thing that I found really interesting, that so many people, for them, this was almost their last choice, right? For keeping a house in the family, keeping a farm in the family. That these are terrible choices that people have to make, whether to do this to their land, to do this to the earth, or to be able to keep their homes and their families in their homes. So,
yeah. Let's see. Well, here's a nice question. I like this question. What is the number one writing advice you give to your students?
Oh, goodness. I wonder if there's a difference between what I would say and what they would say. Number one writing advice. I don't know. I mean, I tried. I still feel very new in all of this. Like, I'm in my 40s, but this is only my second book, and I feel like I have more books in me. So I tend not to give advice to anyone, including my students. What I do encourage them to do is to have a daily writing practice. No book ever gets written by wanting to write. It requires you to actually sit down and do the writing, and reading as much as one possibly can. I think that is, I've never met a writer who is great at writing who doesn't read voraciously. I don't know if you have, Lisa, but yeah. I just think that is so important. So that's what we do in my classes. We practice writing a lot. We read a lot of different writers in a lot of different genres, and try to imagine the ways in which we want to tell our own stories, and how to tell them well. So no advice, but lots of encouragement and lots of creating opportunities to practice and try.
That's the best. That's the best way.
Yeah.
And then I have a question. Oh, can I ask one more question?
Yeah, go right ahead.
I just wanted to ask, like, I think the title is perfect because it's so ironic. But it's also literal too. So it serves like two purposes. And Eleanor recognizes both the beauty and the degradation of the state. And I just wondered when you came upon the title and Was it a late breaking thing, or did you know all along, and how'd you think of it?
It was always titled this, which is very surprising. You know, I can't remember how it came to me. It just sort of fell into my lap, which is such a corny thing to say, but it really did. And it was the title of this manuscript from the earliest incarnation of this book, which is such a difference compared to my first novel that had a bunch of different titles, each one kind of worse than the next, and finally had a title, Shelter, which everyone agreed on that really worked. And I'm so glad that was the final title. But no, this one was always named this, and that always just felt right for it. Not the way it usually happens.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you, Jung. Thank you, Lisa, for the lovely conversation. And thank you to everyone who tuned in tonight. Thank you for, giving us, I guess, just like a lovely night, because as much as we would like the world to be back to normal and do in-store events, it's still nice to be able to attend events like this from home. But again, thank you, everyone. If you would like to purchase a copy of Oh Beautiful, just click on the green purchase button directly below the viewer's screen. It'll take you to our website where you can purchase a copy. And yes, those are Jung's covers. And also, if you tuned in late, don't worry, a replay of this talk will be available after the broadcast ends. So you'll be able to watch the talk from the very beginning by just using the same link. And that about does it. Stay safe, everyone, and have a good night. All right.
Thank you so much, Vera. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Romans, and everyone for watching. Appreciate it.
Yes.